The soft hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as Flight 327 prepared for takeoff from New York to Los Angeles. Passengers were still settling into their seats, overhead bins closing, seatbelts clicking, and flight attendants moving gracefully down the aisle with practiced efficiency. Among the travelers was Lena Carter, a young woman in her early 20s. Her clothes were simple, a faded denim jacket, an old canvas backpack, and worn-out sneakers that had clearly seen better days. She carried herself with quiet humility, clutching a small notebook filled with sketches and scribbled dreams. To her, this trip wasn't just a journey. It was a leap of faith. She had spent months saving for this flight, determined to reach California to attend a design internship interview that could change her life. As Lena found her seat near the middle of the economy cabin, she smiled politely at the passengers around her. Most ignored her, absorbed in their own world of headphones, tablets, and business calls. But one person just 2 rows ahead caught her attention, a man who seemed to command the entire cabin's energy without saying a word. Ethan Ward, in his mid-30s, sat comfortably in his designer suit, tapping on his luxury watch while sipping coffee brought specially by a flight attendant. His tone with the staff was sharp but charming enough to sound almost acceptable. Everyone could tell he was rich, the kind of man who expected attention and obedience. As boarding continued, an elderly woman entered, struggling with her luggage. She looked frail, her silver hair neatly tied back, her hands trembling as she tried to lift her small suitcase into the overhead compartment. Ethan noticed but didn't move. Instead, he sighed loudly, muttering, "Oh great, this is going to take forever." A few passengers chuckled quietly, sharing his impatience. Lena's eyes, however, narrowed. She rose from her seat and walked over to help the woman. "Here, ma'am, let me help you," she said kindly, lifting the bag with both hands and securing it above. The woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you, dear. Not many young people have manners like you anymore." Ethan smirked. "Maybe she just wants attention," he said under his breath, but loud enough for others to hear. A few passengers laughed softly. Lena froze, hearing the remark. She turned to look at him, the smirk still on his face, confident, dismissive, untouchable. The flight attendant glanced nervously between them, unsure whether to intervene. Lena took a slow breath and returned to her seat, determined not to let it ruin her calm, but the words echoed in her mind like static. Moments later, as the plane began to taxi down the runway, Ethan called for a flight attendant again. "Excuse me, I think this seat is broken," he complained. "It's not reclining properly. For what I paid, this is unacceptable." The attendant apologized and promised to check it after takeoff. Ethan rolled his eyes and said loudly, "Figures. This is what happens when they let just anyone on these flights." The nearby passengers laughed again, not because it was funny, but because they feared being his next target. Lena looked out the window, her hands tightening around her notebook. When the plane reached cruising altitude and seatbelt signs turned off, Ethan's arrogance grew louder. He ordered champagne, joked about budget travelers, and complained about how some people clearly don't belong up here. Every insult was veiled, but everyone knew who he meant. Finally, when a flight attendant accidentally spilled a few drops of his drink on the armrest, he snapped, "Unbelievable! Do you people hire anyone?" he barked, making the young attendant blush with embarrassment. The cabin grew tense. People turned away, pretending not to see. But Lena couldn't stay silent anymore. She stood up, her voice calm but firm. "That's enough." Every head turned toward her. The air seemed to thicken instantly. Ethan looked her up and down, amused. "Excuse me? Are you talking to me?" "Yes," Lena said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "You've been rude to everyone since you sat down. The staff, the passengers, even an old woman. You think your money gives you the right to treat people like they're beneath you." The plane fell silent for a heartbeat. Then a few people chuckled, not at her words, but at the sheer audacity of her speaking up. Ethan laughed outright, a cold, arrogant sound. "You should really mind your own business, sweetheart," he said, leaning back in his seat. "You don't know who you're talking to." Lena's chin lifted slightly.
"No, but I know exactly what kind of person you are," she replied.
"The kind who mistakes wealth for worth." The laughter in the cabin shifted, awkward, uncertain. A few passengers exchanged looks. The flight attendant stood frozen, torn between duty and admiration. Ethan's smirk faltered slightly. "Watch your tone," he warned, his voice low. Lena took a step closer, her voice unwavering. "You can buy a first-class ticket, sir, but you can't buy class." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel this time. It was sharp, short, and filled with surprise. Ethan's expression hardened, his pride visibly cracking. He looked around, expecting the crowd to take his side, but now the passengers avoided his eyes. The same people who once laughed with him were now silent, their smiles gone. Lena returned to her seat, her pulse still racing but her face calm. The flight attendant quietly thanked her with a whisper. Ethan sat motionless, staring out the window, his reflection dark against the sunlight. For the first time, he didn't have a comeback. The hum of the airplane filled the silence once more. The tension in the cabin after Lena's bold words lingered like an electric charge, vibrating through the aisle and across the seats. Ethan Ward sat frozen for a moment, disbelief flashing across his face. He had been confronted, publicly, by someone he had assumed would remain silent, invisible, just another passenger to be ignored. Around him, the usual murmur of a cruising airplane was replaced with a quiet, watchful hum. Some passengers whispered to each other, exchanging surprised glances. The earlier laughter at Lena's audacity had faded into a tense, anticipatory quiet. For the first time, Ethan realized the entire cabin had turned their attention toward him, and suddenly, his usual confidence felt heavy, exposed, and fragile. Lena sank back into her seat, keeping her gaze forward but aware of the reactions around her. She could feel the unspoken solidarity from the passengers, a sense that her courage had resonated with them. An older woman a few rows behind nodded subtly, as if silently approving Lena's defiance. A young man in the aisle seat smirked and leaned back, clearly impressed, while a mother gently whispered to her child about standing up for what's right. Lena's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of being the catalyst for this collective shift in the cabin's mood. The energy had changed. The rich man's laughter no longer led the room, and it was muted, replaced by whispers of admiration for the girl who dared to speak the truth. Ethan, now acutely aware of the scrutiny, attempted to regain control. "Do you really think you can lecture me in front of everyone?" he asked, voice slightly higher than intended, trying to mask the tremor of unease creeping in. He adjusted his cufflinks as if polishing them would polish away his embarrassment. Lena, calm and unwavering, met his gaze. "It's not a lecture," she replied softly but firmly. "It's a reality check. You've treated everyone around you like they're beneath you, and it's not acceptable." Her tone was quiet yet forceful, cutting through the ambient hum of the airplane cabin. The surrounding passengers began murmuring quietly, some nodding in agreement. One businessman whispered to his colleague. Finally, someone put him in his place. A flight attendant, who had initially hovered nervously near Ethan, now subtly leaned toward Lena, offering a faint, approving smile. The power dynamics in the cabin had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet palpably. Ethan was no longer the center of admiration or fear. Instead, he was under observation, and the cabin had collectively taken note of who had courage and who had arrogance. Unable to hide his irritation, Ethan leaned forward slightly. "You really think you know everything about me just from a few words?" he snapped, attempting to regain composure, though the mask of arrogance was cracking. Lena's eyes narrowed slightly, unwavering. "I don't need to know everything," she said. "I only need to see how you treat people, and that says everything." Her words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Several passengers shifted in their seats, drawn to the unfolding drama. The initial laughter from a few weeks ago at Ethan's remarks had now transformed into quiet judgment. People no longer laughed at the girl. Instead, they watched in awe, silently rooting for her courage. It was a rare, almost cinematic moment. An ordinary girl challenging someone who believed money could shield him from respect. And slowly, the atmosphere in the cabin tilted in her favor. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he quickly glanced around, realizing the cabin had collectively sided, or at least silently observed, Lena's confrontation. The subtle nods, the whispered approval, the small smiles of encouragement, all of it chipped away at his pride. He tried to maintain his composure, straightening his posture, adjusting his tie, and giving a faint, condescending smirk. "You think you're some kind of hero here?" he sneered, his voice quieter, less confident than before. Lena leaned back slightly, her gaze calm and steady. "Not a hero," she replied, her voice quiet but resonant. Just someone who believes respect isn't bought with money. The cabin remained silent. The hum of engines and air circulation the only sounds, punctuated by occasional whispers of approval or nods from passengers. Ethan's ego had been punctured in front of dozens of witnesses. For the first time he felt vulnerability, an unfamiliar, uncomfortable sensation that made him fidget with his watch, tap his expensive shoes against the floor, and glance nervously at those around him. The laughter that once surrounded his arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a silent acknowledgement that Lena had shifted the balance of authority, at least morally within the cabin. Lena turned her attention back to the window, taking a deep breath. She didn't speak further, letting her calm confidence and unwavering gaze speak volumes. The passengers seemed to collectively exhale, some leaning back in their seats, reassured by her composure. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that she had done more than defend herself. She had set a precedent that even the most entitled individuals must respect the humanity around them. Minutes passed, yet the tension lingered. Ethan's usual smirk had faded completely, replaced by a thoughtful frown. He caught glimpses of passengers staring at him, some shaking their heads subtly, others exchanging glances. For the first time in a long while, he realized that money, power, and status meant nothing in the face of dignity, courage, and moral clarity. Lena had reminded him, and everyone around, that real authority comes not from wealth but from character. As the flight continued its steady cruise, the cabin's energy gradually shifted toward calm. Yet the memory of the confrontation remained palpable. Lena's bravery had left an imprint on the collective consciousness of the passengers. Whispers circulated quietly, stories about standing up to arrogance, the audacity of speaking truth, and the unexpected victory of moral courage over entitlement. Even the flight attendants seemed to carry a subtle pride in their demeanor, observing that one small act of bravery could ripple through the entire environment of the airplane. Ethan sat quietly, now withdrawn, occasionally glancing toward Lena. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a dawning realization that wealth alone did not guarantee respect or fear. He had been publicly confronted, and for the first time he had no ready comeback. The cabin, which had once amplified his arrogance, now reflected quiet judgment and admiration for the girl who had dared to speak. Meanwhile, Lena settled back into her seat, opening her notebook and pretending to sketch. Though her mind replayed the confrontation repeatedly, she didn't gloat. She simply absorbed the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Passengers whispered in quiet tones, some complimenting her courage, others reflecting on the lesson they had silently witnessed. In that suspended, tense moment, it became clear that the dynamic of the flight had permanently changed. Respect had been restored, and arrogance had been humbled. The hum of the airplane engines continued steady and constant, as if echoing the moral of the encounter: courage, dignity, and truth cannot be overshadowed by wealth or entitlement. Lena glanced once more at Ethan, whose eyes met hers fleetingly, a mix of shame, contemplation, and an unspoken acknowledgement of her victory. She smiled faintly to herself, quietly confident that the remainder of the flight would carry a different energy, a silent testament to the power of speaking up, even when all odds seemed stacked against you. The plane continued its journey through the clouds, but inside the cabin, a story had unfolded that would remain in the memory of every passenger. A story of courage, confrontation, and the humbling of arrogance at 30,000 feet. The airplane cabin, which had been tense yet quiet after Lena's confrontation, began to settle into a delicate rhythm. Flight 327 cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the soft hum of the engines blending with the occasional murmur of passengers resuming their activities. Though no one dared to break the unspoken tension entirely, Lena sat upright in her seat, her notebook open, though her pencil moved more as a habit than necessity. Her mind replayed the confrontation, analyzing every expression, every reaction, and every subtle shift in the cabin's energy. Around her, the passengers were no longer laughing at the rich man's arrogance. Their amusement had been replaced by a quiet respect for the girl who had dared to speak truth in front of him. Some stared at her in admiration, others shared knowing glances, and a few subtly shook their heads in disbelief that anyone could stand up to a person so outwardly confident and wealthy. Ethan Ward, still seated across the aisle, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His once sure posture had softened, The confident smirk that had accompanied him throughout boarding and takeoff was now gone, replaced by a subtle, guarded frown. He tapped his fingers against the armrest as though the rhythmic movement could restore some sense of control over a situation that had completely outmaneuvered him. Each glance he stole at Lena carried a mixture of irritation, curiosity, and begrudging respect. He had faced arrogant colleagues demanding clients, and entitled acquaintances in his life, yet this young woman, in her simple clothing and quiet determination, had managed to unravel his composure effortlessly. It was a revelation he hadn't anticipated, and the humbling weight of it pressed on him more heavily with each passing minute. The flight attendant who had been hovering nearby earlier returned to her duties, yet her glances toward Lena lingered a moment longer than necessary. There was a subtle acknowledgement in her eyes, a recognition of the courage it took to confront someone so entitled, in a place where authority and hierarchy often seemed absolute. The rest of the cabin, meanwhile, had shifted its collective energy. Passengers who had initially giggled at the rich man's remarks now observed in quiet contemplation. Children leaned curiously from their seats, sensing the gravity of the moment, while adults exchanged hushed comments about integrity, dignity, and the unexpected power of standing up for oneself. The air was charged not with fear or aggression, but with the moral resonance of what had just occurred. Unable to remain passive, Ethan finally cleared his throat. "You really think that standing here lecturing me changes anything?" he said, his voice slightly strained but still carrying a tone of defiance. Lena met his gaze steadily. "It doesn't change the world," she replied softly, yet each word carried the weight of conviction. "But it changes this moment. And sometimes that's enough." Her response was calm, deliberate, and completely unshaken by his attempt to belittle her. Around them, passengers held their breath, sensing that the confrontation was far from over, yet understanding that Lena now held the moral high ground. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly as though attempting to regain composure. He opened his tablet and pretended to scroll through emails, but the effort to appear occupied was transparent. His eyes kept darting toward Lena, analyzing her posture, her expression, and her subtle air of confidence. For the first time, he experienced the uncomfortable sensation of being observed and judged, not by a single person, but by an entire cabin filled with passengers who had silently aligned themselves with her. Each glance felt like an indictment, a reminder that status, wealth, and entitlement could not shield him from the consequences of his arrogance. Lena, sensing his inner turmoil, allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. She hadn't sought revenge. She hadn't wanted to humiliate him unnecessarily. Her goal had been simple: to assert her dignity, to remind him that no one, regardless of social or financial standing, could belittle others without consequence. Yet she could feel the ripple effect of her actions. Passengers whispered quietly to one another, sharing impressions recounting how rarely they witnessed someone confront entitlement so directly. Some remarked on her courage, others on the unexpected humility it forced upon Ethan. The cabin had become a microcosm of society itself, illustrating the dynamics of power, respect, and the subtle shifts that could occur when someone dared to speak truth. As the flight continued, the rich man attempted to reassert dominance in subtle ways. He tapped on his tablet, adjusted his expensive watch, and even ordered a premium drink from the flight attendant. Yet each gesture felt hollow, performative, and futile. His actions no longer commanded attention or admiration. They drew quiet glances of critique, judgment, and skepticism. The passengers had collectively recognized the imbalance of his behavior, and no amount of money or status could reverse the social recalibration that Lena had initiated. He had been humbled, not by public embarrassment alone, but by the quiet acknowledgement of every witness in the cabin. Meanwhile, Lena returned to her notebook, sketching absent-mindedly but fully aware of every subtle shift around her. She noticed the way some passengers shifted slightly to give her space, the way children looked at her with a mix of curiosity and admiration, the way adults offered faint smiles of approval. Even the flight attendants, trained to remain neutral, seemed to carry a sense of pride in witnessing the moral victory unfold. Lena's thoughts drifted beyond the immediate cabin, contemplating how small acts of courage could ripple outward, inspiring unseen observers, creating subtle change, and leaving a lasting imprint on collective memory. Ethan's frustration began to manifest in quieter, more internalized ways. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together tightly. His usually confident demeanor was replaced by a contemplative, almost defensive posture. He recognized that he had miscalculated, underestimated the power of moral courage, overlooked the influence of collective attention, and failed to anticipate that a single individual, unarmed by wealth or status, could disrupt his carefully maintained aura of authority. It was a realization that forced him into a rare moment of introspection, one that his privileged life had rarely afforded him. The flight attendants, sensing the residual tension, moved strategically through the cabin, serving meals and beverages while maintaining professional composure. Their calm, understated movements contrasted sharply with the lingering moral drama in the air. Passengers, now quietly attentive, returned to their activities, though whispers and occasional glances toward Lena or Ethan persisted. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Lena held the moral high ground, and Ethan was reduced to silent observation, acutely aware that his behavior had been evaluated and judged by dozens of witnesses. As the sun began its slow descent, casting golden light through the airplane windows, Lena's calm composure contrasted vividly with the rich man's unease. The light highlighted the subtle tension lines on his face, the forced rigidity of his posture, and the fleeting moments of vulnerability that betrayed his pride. Lena's features, by contrast, were serene and confident, her quiet strength radiating outward, influencing not only the passengers in her immediate vicinity, but also creating an unspoken ripple effect throughout the cabin. Time seemed to stretch as the plane continued its steady cruise. Lena observed the distant horizon through the window, allowing herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the lessons she had imparted without raising her voice, without resorting to aggression, only through calm, steadfast courage and a refusal to accept disrespect. The power of her presence had reshaped the atmosphere of the cabin, reminding every passenger that dignity and moral clarity could outweigh wealth, arrogance, and entitlement. Ethan, meanwhile, remained unusually silent. He occasionally attempted to interject comments or engage in conversation, but his words fell flat, unnoticed, and unappreciated. The passengers' attention had shifted irrevocably. They now observed him with a mix of skepticism and judgment, aware that he had been challenged and had no satisfactory response. Each passing moment reinforced the quiet transformation in the cabin. Lena had redefined authority in that space, and Ethan, despite his wealth, had no tools to reclaim it. By mid-flight, the cabin had settled into a subdued, respectful energy. Passengers conversed in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward Lena and Ethan, reflecting on the dramatic confrontation that had quietly restructured the social dynamic. Lena, focused yet calm, continued to observe, aware that her role as a witness extended beyond herself. She had sparked a subtle yet profound shift, an affirmation that courage, respect, and moral clarity could influence a collective environment, even within the confined space of an airplane. As the plane cruised steadily, the scene became emblematic of a broader truth. Wealth and status might command attention, but they cannot command respect. The passengers, silent witnesses to the exchange, had collectively internalized the lesson. Lena, the young girl in simple clothes, had demonstrated that standing up for oneself, and for others, held immeasurable power. The cabin, once dominated by arrogance and entitlement, had been transformed by a single act of courage, quietly reverberating through every passenger present. As Flight 327 continued to glide through the cloud-streaked sky, the cabin had taken on an unusual calm. Lena Carter leaned back in her seat, glancing once at the wealthy young man, Ethan Ward, who had fallen into a contemplative silence. The earlier confrontation had shifted the balance of attention entirely. Passengers no longer laughed or whispered mockingly at her. Instead, they were now quietly observing, reflecting on the boldness and dignity she had displayed. There was a subtle energy in the cabin, a shared understanding that something significant had occurred, that a young woman with no wealth or status had spoken a truth powerful enough to command the attention and respect of everyone around her. Ethan's previous arrogance had been stripped away, leaving him visibly uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the armrest, each movement betraying his inner turmoil. He tried to focus on his tablet, scrolling absent-mindedly through emails and financial reports. But his mind kept wandering back to Lena's calm gaze, the firmness of her words, and the way she had subtly dismantled his authority without raising her voice. Around him, passengers exchanged quiet glances, some nodding imperceptibly, as if silently agreeing that Lena's courage had righted an imbalance that had been created by his arrogance. The flight attendants, maintaining their professionalism, seemed to carry a subtle sense of admiration for Lena. One young attendant, delivering refreshments, allowed herself a small smile as she passed Lena's seat, a silent acknowledgement that the girl had done something rare and remarkable. Lena herself felt a strange mix of relief and pride, though she made no gesture to draw attention to herself. Her victory was quiet, unassuming, a moral triumph, not a spectacle. Yet the impact rippled through the cabin. A mother whispered to her child, "See how speaking up matters," while a teenage boy observed in awe, recognizing courage when it appeared in a world too often dominated by wealth and entitlement. Ethan, aware of the shift in energy, attempted to reassert control. He straightened his tie and adjusted his cufflinks, gestures meant to display authority, but the effect was hollow. The collective attention of the cabin no longer bolstered his ego. It highlighted his discomfort. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that no amount of money, status, or bravado could insulate him from the moral weight of his actions. His previous laughter, his dismissive remarks, and his condescending behavior were now seen in stark contrast to Lena's calm, steadfast dignity. The realization gnawed at him, creating a tension he had never experienced in boardrooms, social gatherings, or networking events. The plane's engines hummed steadily, but within the cabin, a quiet drama continued to unfold. Lena observed Ethan discreetly, noting the subtle ways his behavior had changed. His eyes no longer scanned the cabin with a commanding gaze. Instead, they occasionally flicked toward her, betraying a mixture of respect, annoyance, and disbelief. The other passengers, sensing the internal struggle, remained quiet but attentive. It was a rare moment in which silence carried as much meaning as words, a collective acknowledgement of the power of courage and integrity over arrogance and entitlement. Minutes passed, yet the tension did not dissipate. Lena reflected on the journey thus far. The initial laughter at Ethan's arrogance, the confrontation in the aisle, and the resulting shift in the cabin's dynamics. She realized that the moment had not only humbled him, but had subtly altered the perception of everyone present. Passengers had witnessed a moral victory unfold in real time, a rare and unspoken lesson in humility and respect. Lena's heart swelled with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had acted not out of malice but out of a steadfast commitment to fairness and dignity. Ethan's attempts to distract himself proved futile. He adjusted his seat, pretended to read, and even attempted casual conversation with nearby passengers, but the subtle air of judgment and admiration for Lena made each effort awkward and hollow. He found himself thinking repeatedly about the exchange, mentally replaying her words. "You can buy a first-class ticket, sir, but you can't buy class." Those words, simple yet piercing, had lodged firmly in his mind, a reminder that true authority is not earned through wealth or entitlement, but through integrity and respect. The flight attendants continued their rounds, serving meals and beverages with practiced efficiency, yet even they seemed to operate under the quiet influence of Lena's courage. Their movements were more deliberate, their interactions with passengers more thoughtful, as if the confrontation had subtly reminded them of the dignity inherent in every individual, regardless of social or economic status. A young woman in the row behind Lena whispered to her friend, "I hope I'm that brave someday," while another passenger nodded slowly, reflecting on the rare and unexpected demonstration of moral fortitude they had just witnessed. As the hours passed and the plane approached mid-flight, Ethan attempted a more direct engagement. He leaned slightly toward Lena, and in a lower, controlled voice said, "I suppose you think you've proven your point?" Lena looked up from her notebook, her expression calm but resolute. "I didn't need to prove a point," she replied softly. "I just needed to remind someone that respect is earned through behavior, not purchased through wealth." The words were delivered without accusation, yet their impact was undeniable. Ethan's jaw tightened, and for the first time he truly understood that he had no immediate response capable of undoing the effect of her confrontation. The cabin atmosphere had subtly shifted. Passengers were no longer passive observers. They were silent witnesses to a small but significant act of moral courage. Whispers circulated, nods were exchanged, and a quiet admiration for Lena began to permeate the space. It was remarkable how a single person, armed only with courage and integrity, had altered the energy and dynamics of the entire cabin. The rich man's presence, once dominant, had become subdued, almost secondary to the moral authority she now held. Lena reflected on the broader implications of the encounter. She understood that such moments of courage, though small and fleeting, had the potential to influence behavior, shape perceptions, and even inspire change. Each passenger in the cabin had now internalized a subtle lesson, that arrogance and entitlement might command attention, but they cannot command respect. It was a powerful realization, one that Lena knew would linger long after the plane had landed, not only in the minds of those who witnessed the confrontation, but also in the behavior of the man who had been challenged. Ethan, meanwhile, began to confront his own reflection in the window. He saw the flicker of humility, the trace of self-doubt, and the rare awareness of being morally outmaneuvered. It was a sensation that unsettled him deeply. For the first time, he considered that his wealth, charm, and social influence were insufficient to shield him from judgment, especially when confronted with quiet courage. The realization was uncomfortable yet necessary, forcing him to reflect on the manner in which he had treated others and the subtle arrogance that had so often gone unchecked. As the plane continued its smooth course through the clouds, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Passengers returned to their reading devices or casual conversations, but the memory of the confrontation lingered in every glance, every subtle interaction, and every quiet nod. Lena's composure, quiet confidence, and moral clarity had reshaped the atmosphere entirely. The rich man, once the center of attention and amusement, now existed in a muted space of reflection, aware that his usual tactics of command and intimidation had failed. By the time the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the cabin in warm amber light, the tension had transformed into a reflective energy. Passengers exchanged subtle smiles, some quietly congratulating Lena in thought, others recognizing the rare demonstration of moral courage they had witnessed. Ethan, facing the fading light and his own reflection, understood that he had been humbled in a manner he could neither deny nor ignore. Lena, notebook closed, pencil resting lightly between her fingers, allowed herself a small private smile. She had acted with quiet integrity, never intending to humiliate or shame, but simply to stand for dignity and respect. The effect had been profound, far beyond her expectations. She had reminded everyone, including the arrogant, entitled young man, that true authority comes not from wealth or status, but from courage, composure, and moral clarity. As Flight 327 continued toward its destination, the cabin settled into a serene, almost reverent atmosphere. The passengers had witnessed more than just a confrontation. They had experienced a lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet power of standing up for what is right. Lena's influence had rippled through the cabin, creating a subtle yet lasting impression on every person present. The flight continued smoothly, yet the echoes of her courage would resonate far longer, a testament to the extraordinary impact of a single, determined individual speaking truth to power. The plane had been gliding smoothly for several hours now, the rhythmic hum of the engines blending seamlessly with the soft murmurs of passengers returning to their activities. But inside the cabin, a subtle, almost imperceptible energy lingered, a residue of the confrontation that had unfolded earlier. Lena Carter, still seated upright with her notebook tucked neatly under her arm, sensed the shift even as she pretended to sketch. Her calm composure had not wavered, but the impact of her words reverberated through the cabin, changing the dynamic in ways she could feel but not fully see. Passengers were no longer merely observing. They were reflecting, inspired by the quiet courage of a young woman who had dared to speak truth to arrogance. Ethan Ward, the wealthy young man whose arrogance had dominated the early hours of the flight, remained slouched in his seat, staring out the window with an expression of rare introspection. His tailored suit, expensive watch, and polished shoes now seemed almost symbolic of the superficial armor he had relied upon for so long, armor that had been quietly dismantled by Lena's calm authority. He shifted uncomfortably, catching glimpses of passengers stealing discreet looks toward him. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered mockery. Instead, the cabin reflected a quiet acknowledgement that Lena had changed the tone, restored dignity, and reminded everyone present that status and wealth were never substitutes for respect. The flight attendants, trained to remain neutral, carried themselves with an understated sense of admiration. One attendant paused mid-aisle, subtly nodding toward Lena as she passed, a silent acknowledgement of the courage that had transformed the cabin's atmosphere. Another whispered quietly to a colleague, "I've never seen anyone handle that so gracefully." Their professionalism remained intact, but their recognition of moral strength was evident. In the rows behind Lena, passengers exchanged subtle glances, nods, and quiet smiles, each silently affirming the lesson they had just witnessed. That standing up with dignity could ripple outward, influencing not only the immediate moment, but the collective consciousness of everyone around. Ethan attempted to reclaim some sense of authority. He adjusted his tie, tapped his fingers against the armrest, and tried to focus on his tablet. Yet the effort was hollow. The air around him no longer reinforced his ego. Instead, it amplified his unease. Every glance from a passenger felt weighted with judgment, subtle but undeniable. He realized that the arrogance that had carried him through life, the charm, the wealth, the dismissive wit, had failed him entirely in this confined space. Lena had demonstrated that courage and moral clarity could outweigh power, entitlement, and money. Minutes turned into an hour, yet the cabin's energy remained subtly transformed. Lena's quiet confidence served as a magnet, drawing the attention and admiration of those around her. Children peeked from their seats, curious and wide-eyed, sensing the presence of someone extraordinary. Adults exchanged small smiles, nods, and whispered affirmations, recognizing the impact of courage expressed with calm authority. The rich man, meanwhile, sat in growing self-awareness, his earlier smirk replaced by reflective silence. For the first time in a long while, he experienced the discomfort of moral humility, a sensation unfamiliar and jarring, yet undeniably necessary. Lena took a slow breath, glancing around the cabin with quiet observance. She noticed a young man in the row behind her subtly straighten his posture. Inspired by her bravery, a mother gently held her child, whispering a quiet explanation about standing up for oneself. The subtle ripple effect of her actions extended beyond her immediate sphere. It had touched each passenger in its own way, creating a shared moment of reflection, a collective acknowledgement that dignity and respect were not commodities to be bought, but virtues to be earned. Ethan's eyes, drawn repeatedly to Lena, betrayed a mixture of frustration, awe, and reluctant respect. He recognized finally that the confrontation had changed something fundamental. The power he had assumed to possess through wealth and status was no longer absolute. It was fragile, mutable, and subject to the quiet force of integrity. The cabin itself had become a theater for this realization. Passengers no longer viewed him as dominant. They observed him as someone who had been momentarily humbled by truth and courage. The shift was subtle but profound, a silent transformation that would linger long after the plane touched down. As the flight neared the west coast, the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows. The cabin was bathed in soft light, illuminating the expressions of passengers and highlighting the contrast between Lena's composed demeanor and Ethan's uneasy reflection. She glanced at him once more, offering a small, polite smile, a gesture devoid of malice but full of quiet confidence. It was a reminder that humility, integrity, and moral courage could leave an indelible mark, even on those accustomed to entitlement and privilege. Ethan, for his part, made no comment. He did not attempt to reassert dominance or reclaim lost pride. Instead, he sat quietly, absorbing the lesson he had been forced to confront. He glanced at the passengers, noting their subtle reactions, their whispers of approval toward Lena, and their muted respect. He realized that in this microcosm of society, a single airplane cabin, wealth had been rendered irrelevant in the face of courage and moral clarity. The flight attendants moved gracefully along the aisles, continuing their duties, but the tension and subtle admiration in the cabin lingered. Lena observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. She had acted with integrity, not seeking recognition or applause, yet her influence was undeniable. She had reminded everyone present, including the rich young man, that the weight of one's character carried more significance than the superficial markers of status. Each passenger, from the youngest child to the oldest adult, had silently absorbed that lesson. Hours passed, the flight continuing smoothly. Lena leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly as she reflected on the journey so far, not just across the country, but through a microcosm of human behavior, courage, and morality. She thought of the subtle shifts she had witnessed, passengers quietly acknowledging her bravery, the flight attendants' understated approval, and the rare, contemplative silence that had settled over Ethan. In this confined space, she had changed the narrative, restored dignity, and demonstrated the quiet yet undeniable power of standing up for what is right. Finally, as Flight 327 began its descent toward Los Angeles, the passengers settled into their final moments of reflection. Some whispered quietly about the confrontation, marveling at the courage they had witnessed. Others glanced at Lena with admiration, recognizing that her actions had transformed an ordinary flight into a story they would carry with them. Ethan, now silent and contemplative, stared at the approaching city lights below, perhaps realizing that humility and respect are lessons that cannot be purchased but must be internalized. Lena, notebook in hand, allowed herself a small, private smile. She had acted with integrity, defended dignity, and reminded an entire cabin that true authority comes not from wealth or status, but from courage, character, and moral clarity. The airplane touched down smoothly, engines slowing, and the passengers prepared to disembark. Yet the impact of the confrontation, the lesson of respect, humility, and moral courage, would linger far beyond the confines of the cabin. As the doors opened and the passengers filed out, Lena walked with quiet confidence, a young woman who had not only navigated a flight across the country, but had also navigated the intricate dynamics of human behavior, power, and dignity. Behind her, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the emptying rows, reflecting on the unexpected lesson imparted by someone he had underestimated. The cabin, now quiet and ordinary once more, bore the silent imprint of courage, respect, and the indelible power of standing up for what is right, a reminder that sometimes the smallest actions can leave the largest impact. Flight 327 had carried more than passengers that day. It had carried a story, one of courage, humility, and the subtle but profound transformation that occurs when truth and integrity confront arrogance. And as Lena stepped into the terminal, her journey continued, not just across the country but into the hearts and minds of everyone who had borne witness to her quiet, unforgettable act of bravery.